in 2010, I was in the Sichuan province, which is a mountainous region in southwest China, where 2 years earlier it had been devastated by a magnitude 8 earthquake. 70,000 people died. And the only option for the survivors was to rebuild. And you see, rebuilding was the reason for my visit. I was there working with local farmers to figure out, as part of my company, how we could help them reestablish their sustainable soybean crop. And as part of that working with them throughout the day, one of the solutions we came up with was essentially to figure out how to move water uphill so that the crop could flourish. Now, I'm an agricultural economist, not an engineer. So you might imagine what was going on in my mind in that moment, and maybe some of you have had this similar feeling throughout your career in certain moments. It's the exactly how did I get here moment. You can relate. And I have to admit, as I was preparing to come and have a conversation with you today, I was conjuring up some of those similar feelings. Exactly how did I get here? How did I get here to Devex to spend time with some of the most prominent development professionals in the world? You see, I admire what each and every one of you do every day. You are advocates and activists for some of the most marginalized people in society. And you work day in and day out to make the world a more just place, a more peaceful place, a more equitable place. Quite frankly, a better place. And so the conclusion I came to is I too am a development professional, even though I'm in the private sector. And we can come together as professionals, and we do, around a shared vision. We have a shared vision for a better future, not just we have a shared vision for a better life on this planet, but not just for today, but for the future. And so it's with that shared vision in mind that I'm going to accomplish my own engineering feat right here on this stage. Wait for it, right? Right here on this stage, because I am here to convince you all that there is a radical new tool out there, a radical development tool, that if we work together collectively, this tool has the ability to advance sustainable development. And not only advance the SDGs, accelerate their impact. Are you ready for it? I'm talking about trade. Now, see, I did expect to hear a few audible gasps, right? Okay, I admit I'm feeling a bit vulnerable because here you came to learn about an innovative new tool, and here I am talking about trade. Surprise, surprise, the corporate gal, Devry, talking about the very thing that advances her company's bottom line the most. And you're right, it does. But that's not why I'm here. Trade, the great connector, has often been viewed as the great divider. In fact, trade has been blamed for some of the very social and economic and environmental ills that we are all here to collectively defeat. Free trade, fair trade, open trade. It has not always lived up to its promises. In fact, even though trade can account for pulling millions of people out of poverty, and even as President Macron of France recently said that multilateralism is a force for good, even still, there are winners and there are losers in trade. And human bias still exists in the system. And so some may have benefited at the expense of others. And there are inequities that still exist. And so you're right if you're feeling a sense of skepticism about trade. But you're also right to be optimistic. And here's where my engineering feat comes in today, because I believe that trade, if done responsibly, I believe that I can convince you all here today to think about it in a different way, to think about it as an innovative development tool, to tip trade on its head, if you will. And what I mean by trade being done responsibly is that it's done in a rules-based system. And I'll define responsible trade as it is in SDG 2, that it's open, it's transparent, it addresses inequities, it addresses human rights, it ensures that there's sustainable use of land and water. It addresses responsible production and responsible consumption. That responsible trade, coupled with other important policy actions, can very well lead the way in helping us to advance the Sustainable Development Goals. And so I share with you this picture. This is a picture from one of my many visits to Cuba. It's a place that I hold dear in my heart. And in fact, one of my first visits to Cuba was to attempt to sell food under the humanitarian exemptions in the embargo. Talk about moving water uphill. But on this particular visit, I was there. We brought together some of the top NGO leaders, leaders in the food and ag industry in the United States, and farmers. And we visited the island to engage with the ministries and also to go on some learning journeys throughout the island. And I remember feeling that it was so hot and it was so humid, and we loaded up our buses, and the municipality that I visited on this particular visit was the municipality of Artemisia, which is about an hour outside of Havana. And it has great port access, so there's some great trade potential there. And I was struck at the moment when we offloaded the buses at how very quickly the farmers in our group gravitated toward the farmers in the Cuban cooperative. It was an immediate farmer-to-farmer connection. And they actually started talking excitedly about opportunities, perhaps trading winter vegetables for soybeans. And I remember there were these old Russian red tractors. They were rusty. I don't know how old they are, maybe from the 1940s or 1950s. And some of them still had their engines pulled out and put on blocks. And they were maybe tinkering with the engines. And I thought about the fact that those tractors, they represented opportunity, they represented potential for those Cuban farmers. And I remember Jesus. Jesus was using this wooden implement that you see here. Likely he built it himself. And he had it attached behind his tired, probably hungry, yet noticeably loved oxen. And Jesus was using this wooden implement to draw rows out in the field. And I remember thinking that that was just incredibly back-breaking work. And why did Jesus have to work so hard when just 90 miles away, farming looked so different in the United States? And the answer was the reason for our visit. The answer was trade, or the lack thereof. It was the embargo. And you see, we have the ability to impact 11 million lives. That's 11 million lives in Cuba if we can simply restore trade. And that impacts smallholder farmers and rural communities in a way that tourism alone cannot. And if you ask me, and I bet you're asking me, that is a pretty radical development tool. But you see, it's not just in Cuba. I think about all of the work you do all around the world, all of the work I do at Cargill, in partnership around the world trying to advance sustainable development. And it's the same everywhere we go. For the Muslim fishermen that I met in the Kutch region working with CARE, whose hands were blistered because they pulled battered nets of fish from the sea, yet they were dreaming of a more prosperous future for their school-age daughters that we were working to educate. For the smallholder cocoa farmers in Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire that my colleagues work with every day, yet they work with them on advancing their cocoa crop, but that crop is nothing if it can't go from farm to market. And for Jesus in Cuba. You see, the more and more I travel, the more and more it becomes crystallized for me. And in fact, it's become a mantra of mine. And that mantra is this: for those who have the power and the ability to come to the table and agree, they owe it to those who can't. And when I think about that coming to the table, think about what just happened several hours ago. What a timely moment. Two governments came to the table to talk who had not talked in a very long time. And my hope is that the 25 million citizens of North Korea can go from dark to light. Because think about what the power of trade can do for those 25 million citizens. who most of which live in poverty and are food insecure. And when I think about the power of trade, I also worry because trade has been disregarded, it's been misunderstood, and often it has been villainized. And that needs to end here, and it needs to end today. Because SDG 17 is asking that we partner together on trade as a development tool. But the only way that it ends is if we have advocates, but not just advocates, activists, you and me here together as activists. Because if we don't have activists setting expectations that our governments come together around responsible trade, then we run the risk that isolationism becomes the order of the day. And so, I realize that we have this moment and that it's time. It's time for the United States to re-enter the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It's time to end the embargo on Cuba. It is time to open North Korea. It is time for NAFTA to be seen as the development tool that it is. And here's the most radical development idea in the world. It is time for us to get back to the table in Geneva, to get back to the WTO. And now I realize this. I realize what I'm asking is a bit like moving water uphill, right? That for how different we are or how different we think we might be, corporations, government, civil society, NGOs, I'm asking that we come together around a shared trade agenda. But we've been there before. How many of you remember the Doha Development Round? I certainly remember being in Hong Kong in 2005 at a pretty instrumental ministerial where trade was recognized as a development tool, right? Trade was recognized as a development tool. But the thing is, we still haven't seen a successful conclusion to the Doha Development Round because those conversations, trade and development, have been taking place in parallel. And now we need to bring them together around a shared trade agenda. And so I have a simple ask, and today we've been talking about calls to action. And my call to action is, can we simply agree to work together? Can we simply agree to use every tool in our toolkit to advance the Sustainable Development Goals? Can we simply agree? For those who can't agree, and it's not because they wouldn't try, it's because they don't have a seat at the table. I believe the answer is yes. So how about it? Let's move water uphill together. Thank you.